Whee!
Woohoo! I absolutely loved Mario Kart on the Wii. Mario Kart has been a staple in so many people's childhood, and this one was mine. And as I'm sure we all know with racing games, they're usually better when you're able to race against a real person, rather than a robot.
That sounds like a blast. I'd love to join you for some Mario Kart.
You keep getting in here, I keep
Let's
changing
fire
the
it up.
locks. There was only one problem. I didn't have many friends to play with. But that's where my parents come into play. A big reason as to why the Wii did so well when it was first released was because it could be seen as a real family console, where everyone could understand the controls and better their skills with it over time. I figured Mario Kart wasn't too difficult, especially for people who don't play games too often, like my parents. So I booted up the Wii, put in Mario Kart, and noticed that this was going to be way too difficult for them. While my parents have played games before, this game proved to be rather difficult for them. Sure, they were able to figure out some of the controls with some more practice, but those first few races usually amounted to being confused and saying that there were too many buttons. To you, me, and everyone else who plays games in their free time, this list of controls doesn't seem too complicated. That is, until you realize that many of the same buttons do different actions depending on the situation the game has for you. Just the B button does 4 things: drifting, braking, reversing, and hopping. It wasn't that the game was too hard for them, it was that it was essentially too confusing for them. Over time, though, we didn't play many other video games after that. My parents have seen me play games before just on the screen, but it was still confusing for them once they began trying. But that's when I had an idea. What? Oh. That subscribe button. Always getting in places it shouldn't be. Of course, it only stays below the video once you click it and make it gray, so if you could do that, that would be a great help. Alright, don't worry, I'll check on you later. You can stay with AI Jared for now. He doesn't bite, I think. He doesn't have teeth, so you should be fine. Anyway, as I was saying, that's when I had an idea. I wanted my parents to figure out how gaming worked and teach them the basics. Of course, this was going to be a challenge. I needed 2 games that would work similar to each other, keep them engaged, and be a good entry point for them. They have played games in the past, so this isn't completely new to them. Even before I showed up, they were playing a lot of the original PlayStation 1 and 2 games. So I knew they could do something more basic than just Mario. And after looking through many different games, I finalized on 2 that would work best for them and their skill levels. For my mom, I picked It Takes Two. Not only is the story something that's engaging, but it's also bright and colorful. For my dad, A Way Out seemed like a perfect fit. A much darker story, fun characters, this was going to work out great for him. Now I can already hear you. Yes, both games are multiplayer. This was done intentionally. While I have seen both games before just on YouTube, these are games that I have myself never played before. So we would all be starting at the same point in the game and learning its mechanics at the same time. I also wanted there to be a sense of collaboration. Playing a game on your own, or really doing just about anything on your own, and having someone watch you can make you feel judged, leading you to stop what you're doing. By working together, though, this judgment is taken away. I would also be the second player with both of them in their respected games. When one of them were confused on a certain aspect, I could act as a helping hand, or we could both work together. With that now out of the way, let's take a look at how my mom did with her game, It Takes Two. For those who don't know, or maybe have just forgotten, the main story focuses on a mother and father discussing the idea behind getting a divorce. Thanks to the power of their daughter's tears, they become clay figures of themselves that their daughter made. Why did she make them? I don't know. Why does she have clay figures of her parents? We also don't know. But you're given almost no time to question that, because here comes a romance book talking about relationships. Where did she get the book? You know, it's rude to ask so many questions. Now, as soon as the game began, I knew what I was supposed to do. I knew from playing other games that the left stick would make me move and the right stick would work the camera. This is pretty standard in almost any game that you play. Though my mom had a more difficult time. She wasn't sure how to move her character and the camera at the same time, leading to a lot of her movements being very stiff. Along with that, there was also the issue of the buttons. Now, the game does a good job of telling you when to push certain buttons, but it doesn't tell you where those buttons are on your controller because the game already assumes that you know where those buttons are. And you know what they say about those who assume. When you assume, you make a... What are you doing? But this is a PG channel. Fine. Just ask your parents what this means. Or look it up, I can't stop you. With my help, she was able to figure out the controls pretty quickly. But I won't lie, those first few sessions were difficult, to say the least. What I did like about this opening section of the game, though, was that there was no rush of any kind. She was able to learn the controls on her own. Later on, when the controls started to get harder, she was still able to develop her skills and figure out what the game was asking her to do. Now, with the other games she's tried, I've noticed that she likes to explore and tries to interact with just about anything she can see. With this game, though, it was straightforward with what she could and couldn't interact with, and what each thing did. It should also be mentioned that the game has many different mechanics in it, especially ones that require both people to work together. Later on in the game, you both enter a large tree, where one person is given a sap gun and the other a flamethrower. My mom naturally got the flamethrower.
Boom.
Sure, both mechanics can work together on their own, but to solve certain puzzles, I guess you could say it takes two. This was also where I was glad we were able to both play this game. This was a mechanic I haven't seen in many other games, so having both of us figure out these puzzles allowed us both to be on a level playing field. It also led to my mom taking the lead at certain times and solving the puzzles on her own. While I may understand the basic elements in certain games, my mom is much better at puzzles. There's also a lot of different mechanics in this game. This one is pretty simple. One person shoots sap, the other person lights it on fire, and usually something explodes. But there's other levels where you change sizes, or you fly, you become flowers. Like I said, this game is pretty weird at times. Though what this game does very well is teach both players what your individual mechanic does through cutscenes. By showing what the character does to the player in a straightforward way, it makes it easier for the player to know what they can do and how their mechanics can work together to progress. This really started to click for my mom a little later in the game, but once it did, we were able to fly through certain levels much quicker than before. Near the end of the game, I noticed that we were both completely focused on this game and its story. It stopped being a time to play just another game for my mom. She wanted to see the story and figure out how it ended. Yes, at times it got weird. We both took a break from the game following the elephant scene. But for the most part, we lost track of time because it was so engaging. By the end of the game, my mom had figured out how the basic controls of normal games work. She also noted that she didn't even know games were like this in the sense of stories. Everyone already knows that games are looking better than they were years ago, but she wasn't aware that games had more now than just guns and fighting. Another topic for another day perhaps, but the way that games are perceived by the news and just as a whole seems to be primarily through violence in many of the more mature games. This story here focuses on relationships, family, love, working together through hardships. I was glad that she was able to see the joy in games and enjoyed it. Games aren't just about violence and guns and destruction. They're just like any other form of media, able to tell captivating stories with real emotion in them.
Cody, I used to think you were completely irrational. But I have to say, You make more sense now.
Meanwhile, I introduced my dad to A Way Out, a much more graphic game that focuses on two inmates trying to escape jail and kill the men who put them in there with violence, guns, and destruction.
Run, run, run!
Relax, man, I got this.
This game is much different from the last in that it tells a much darker story and doesn't have the same cheerful attitude as the last one. This was done on purpose, as my dad enjoys movies and stories that have risk and unexpected turns in them. His enjoyment of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul were also what led me to pick this game out of any other for him to try. It also helped that this game was made by the same publishers as It Takes Two, so he would already know some of the certain characteristics from watching my mom and I play the last one. Some differences though between A Way Out and It Takes Two though that made it difficult for my dad were quick. Just like my mom, my dad wasn't sure about how the camera and moving could work together. Again, I was able to help him out where I could, but there were times where my dad just believed that the best idea would be to walk wherever he wanted to go. Luckily enough, the levels in this game's opening are fairly linear, forcing him to go in certain areas. There were also less things on the screen, which seemed to also impact the way my dad played this game. Where my mom knew what she could and couldn't interact with, my dad didn't have the same help, leading him to try to interact with just about anything he could, even if he couldn't. This caused him to get confused and wonder if the game was broken. It took some time, but he began to realize what he could and couldn't do within this game. This connection between what he can do in the real world with what can be done in the game can be a tough one to break, but once it's broken, the player is really given the chance to fully appreciate the game for what it is. During this opening, my dad was given plenty of time to figure out the layout of the controls. Different visuals were shown directly to us, leading to almost no confusion. Of course, there was the occasional instruction that didn't make any sense, but for the most part, they were understood by my dad. Throughout the rest of the jail level, there wasn't much confusion with the controls or what we could do. It seemed as though this was another game that could be helpful for my dad to understand how gaming worked. That was, until the game really started. Up to this point, there weren't many moments where we could both fail. We both may have messed up something, but that didn't restart the entire level. After the jail level, all bets were off. If either of us died or messed up in any way, we both had to reset. This really became clear to us when we entered a level at the construction site. Compared to the other levels, this was a much more opened level, encouraging us to explore the world around us. While I was ready to keep moving on, my dad tended to go to the extra stuff, like arm wrestling. At first, I thought it was because he wanted to explore more of the world, though it wasn't until after that he said he thought that these things were the things he had to do. What's clear for one person isn't necessarily clear for the other, and the same stayed true here. The moment that really made us both struggle, though, was what I feared with teaching both my mom and dad: QuickTime events. In the same level, you both chase the person you're after by jumping over gaps and traversing the area quickly. While it is a relatively short section of the game, we both constantly messed up, which caused us to both start over many times. We eventually got it, but we were essentially both emotionally drained after that. What surprised me though was that following this, we were both much more focused on the game. My dad, just like my mom, had bettered his own skills and knew that he could do whatever else this game threw at him. It stopped being I have to figure out the controls with this game, and more I have to catch this guy. Plus, following this section, we were both able to torture the guy we were chasing, so son and dad bonding time. As the game continued, the levels continued to get harder and harder. At times, we were both struggling to keep up with one another. This is something I think It Takes Two did much better than A Way Out. With my mom, she was able to complete each section of the game mainly on her own with very little stress. She was allowed to mess up, and at times, even encouraged to mess up so that she could learn. Here, there was very little forgiveness, even if just one player messed up. It also didn't help that this game is much quicker than the other, leading to both of us having very little time to learn the mechanics. I will say though, there are a lot less mechanics to learn than the other, but even the mechanics here can be tough to learn for someone who hasn't ever played a game like this before. By the end of the game, both players are forced into a standoff, where one player has to kill the other. This is the part of the game where everything the players have learned is put to the test. This was also where I became interested in how my dad would do. Having never played a game like this in years, he actually did really good. That sounds rude, but I don't know how else to say it. He was focused and actually trying to win this part of the game. Of course, there were parts of the game where I had the advantage, especially when it came to the shooting at the end, but it was much closer than I thought it would be.
Yours forever, Vincent.
Overall, there were likely better games I could have picked for my dad to try, but for the most part, he seemed to really enjoy this game. Through picking apart the story and coming across the random side activities, there wasn't much that my dad didn't enjoy about this game. Comparing his understanding from before this game to after, he did much better and seemed to enjoy what it had to offer. Now, this is great and all that my parents have played a video game, but what does it mean for introducing people to games? Well, first, I think it's important to consider not only the level at which the game can be understood in, but also the interest of the game. My parents both enjoyed the game they played because it fit their interest. Both games also did well in being good starting points for new players, while also still being engaging enough for players who knew the basics of games. Though It Takes Two seemed to be much better suited for supporting new players. With minimal areas where both players can lose and levels not taking long, both players will likely enjoy their time much more. The instructions are clear for everyone as well. A Way Out is also a good place for new players, but it seems to have a much greater assumption that the players already know how to play games, especially multiplayer games. When picking a game, it's good to keep in mind that everyone learns in different ways and at different rates. If anything, I think these games gave them a better understanding on how games today are and how they work. Now that's just what I think about how these games did, but what about you? If you could recommend a game for new players to start with, what would it be? Anyway guys, thank you for watching this video, and remember to chase the chaos.